On a winter night in the Palatine hills, a red lantern was set against a door, and a family held its breath. The clang of imperial sandals on stone was not the sound of a guest, it was an order. In that single moment, a daughter could be taken, and a household torn apart, not by blade or plague, but by a system designed to erase who she was. Those who lived through the palace called that erasure worse than death. This is the story of how one emperor's whims hardened into an institution of humiliation, and how the things done inside his palace, according to the voices we still have from antiquity, left scars that outlasted the body. It is a tale pieced together from hostile chroniclers, fragmentary accounts, and the silences that history itself preserves. I will speak both of power and of the people it consumes. And when I tell you of a girl named Flavia, know that she is a composite, a representative figure drawn from many fragments to give a human face to a pattern described by ancient writers. If the darker corners of history hold you, subscribe now. We'll return to this thread and others like it. Gaius Julius Caesar Augustus Germanicus, the man whom history remembers as Caligula, did not appear fully formed. He was born into an imperial line that both adored and feared him. His father, the popular general Germanicus, died under suspicious circumstances when Gaius was still a child. The political theater of Rome offered him a pedestal that could both elevate and isolate. Nicknamed Caligula after the little soldier's boots he wore as a boy among his father's troops, he learned early that identity was something publicly displayed and publicly policed. That boyhood among soldiers left impressions of discipline, spectacle, and a kind of performative authority. Later, when he was sent to the island of Capri and into the orbit of the aging emperor Tiberius, those impressions hardened into darker lessons. Ancient chroniclers suggest that Capri became a crucible. Isolation, rumor, and an atmosphere of cruel games among a shrinking court taught the young prince how theatrical cruelty could be wielded as a form of governance. Suetonius and Cassius Dio report a court where fear bred cruelty. Modern historians caution that these accounts often come from sources hostile to Caligula, yet the convergence of their descriptions points to a pattern. Power concentrated and unchecked tends to invent rights that demean both the ruler and the ruled. There was a sickness that changed him further. Ancient accounts record that a serious illness, perhaps fever or encephalitis, left Gaius weakened, then transformed. Survivors of that period speak less of a return to simple health than of a shattering of restraint.
Imagine Flavia becoming the 14th in an inventory, a bureaucratic designation that could be stamped on a ledger, requested at a banquet, or granted as a prize. To be reduced to a numeral is to be precluded from future claim to agency. It is a dissolution of a future self. Another mechanism was the ritual of waiting. The accounts emphasize the eternity of anticipation, the way days stretched into a suspension designed to break rhythms of ordinary life. Waiting becomes a weapon when a person is kept in a loop of hope and dread, summoned to a dressing room where jewels are fixed and perfume is applied, then told to return to a pale anteroom and wait, promised favors one evening, humiliated the next. The chroniclers use a vocabulary of whiplash, emotions and expectations pulled hard, then released. Psychologists today recognize how such cycles of intermittent reward and punishment create dependency and disorientation. In the palace, where every need could be met and every hope revoked, dependence was engineered into survival. Public spectacle amplified the harm. Caligula is said to have staged ritual displays, banquets and parades, where people were shown as ornaments to a court's appetites. Senators and generals, who were supposed to be men of dignity, were nonetheless invited or coerced into attendance. Ancient records suggest that the elite's presence at spectacle functioned as both endorsement and camouflage. Their silence allowed the institution to calcify. A father could be summoned to watch his daughter pass like a relic. A husband might be told to accept the removal of his wife as an imperial prerogative. Whether these scenes were always literal or sometimes rhetorical amplifications by hostile writers, the picture that emerges is of a ruling class that normalized, or at least tolerated, public domination. The economic mechanisms were equally brutal. The imperial court had means of transforming family wealth and status into compliance. Dowries could be confiscated or diminished. Sons and fathers could be offered positions in exchange for silence. Some accounts, particularly those leaning on gossip and rumor, speak of auctions or competitions in which women were sold to the highest official. We must treat such claims with caution. Antiquity loved scandal, and writers often used lurid images to lambast a ruler's excesses. Still, when multiple accounts describe transfers of women as prizes or rewards, a consistent pattern of commodification appears. The courthouse of the imperial household was not bound by ordinary laws of consent. The human consequences are the point at which horror surpasses death. Death is final. It ends the possibility of suffering and the possibility of return. But the violation described in these accounts, if we accept the broad outlines, is an erasure that leaves a living person intact in body, but hollowed in identity. Flavia's composite narrative helps make this concrete.
Imagine a girl returned to her family months later. She walks the streets, she sits at the table, but the social expectations of womanhood, marriage, motherhood, standing in the neighborhood, are altered forever. She may be physically spared, but her future prospects are ruined. Husbands refuse her. Families whisper about shame. If she tries to marry, suitors know she has been in the imperial household. If she tries to say no to shame, the memory lingers, and in many circles, it is treated as a stain. The records speak of suicides. Several ancient sources record suicides among those touched by the palace's machinery, daughters who found death to be a refuge from a life in which the self had been compromised. When historians translate these accounts into modern terms, they often frame them as evidence of traumatized persons who saw no pathway back from social annihilation. The precise counts are contested. Some sources record specific numbers, others merely hint at tragedies. It is proper then to say, according to ancient accounts and reported by later historians, suicides occurred among those who had been subjected to palace humiliation. Whether the totals are accurate is debated, but the occurrence of such despair is plausible and consistent with the psychological collapse described elsewhere. Not all survivors disappeared into private quiet. Some became living symbols of the price exacted by the court. In certain recorded instances, Claudius, who succeeded Caligula in January 41 AD after the emperor's assassination, arranged for payments or dowries for returned women to restore some semblance of social standing. Ancient chroniclers describe this as an attempt to repair public scandal, provide money, marry off the women, and restore social order. Yet payment cannot ransom identity. The dowry is a practical remedy in the marketplace of marriage, but it does not erase the memory carved into a person's psyche. The record suggests more of a political management of fallout than an ethical reckoning. This is where the institutional complicity becomes most disturbing. The Praetorian Guard, the emperor's personal soldiers, were both instruments and witnesses. They enforced orders, moved people, and sometimes participated in acts that later writers called humiliations. Senators watched and profit-seekers accommodated. Noble families made choices between resistance and survival. The accounts imply a social logic. The closer one was to power, the greater the incentive to accept indignity in exchange for favor. Silence, in such a climate, is both an act of self-preservation and a moral failure. At the same time, the machinery produced its own resistance. Those within the imperial household saw the degradation and understood its destabilizing potential. Among the Praetorians and a small circle of officers, outrage and humiliation festered.
Cassius Chaerea, a tribune of the guard, is historically named as one of the conspirators who plotted to kill the emperor. Ancient sources describe Chaerea as a man who bore public insult and private injury. Whether his motives were purely personal vengeance, moral outrage, or a mixture of both is debated. What is important for our pattern is this: systems that humiliate pillars of state create enemies with a rationale for assassination. Empire, when run as theater in torment, cultivates plots as surely as it cultivates favors. When the assassination finally came, it was messy and abrupt. Members of Caligula's household, including several conspirators and disaffected guards, attacked him in the underground passages of the palace, the cryptoporticus, and stabbed him repeatedly. Ancient chroniclers describe not merely the violence, but the humiliation. Some accounts paint the scene as brutal and degrading, the emperor begging, the attackers closing in until the figure of imperial dignity collapsed into a limp body.
These images are offered by hostile writers who sought to underline both the ruler's fall and the moral of his excess. It is vital to hold a balanced view. The assassination was a political act that ended one life, but did not immediately dismantle the institutional patterns that created the abuses. The immediate aftermath was chaos. Power vacuums invite opportunism. Claudius, who emerged as the next emperor, took rapid steps to stabilize Rome. He placated the Praetorians, consolidated power, and attempted to manage the palace scandal. For the women who had been in the Garden of Venus, Claudius's policy reportedly involved monetary settlements and arranged matches, practical measures aimed at quieting public outrage and restoring social order. Ancient sources suggest that Claudius preferred administrative fixes to moral inquiry. Whether this was cynical calculation or pragmatic governance is a question of interpretation, but the effect was the same. The system's public face was smoothed over without a full accounting of harm. That smoothing over is the work of cover-up. When an institution prioritizes its continuity over truth, the memory of victims is truncated into receipts and settlements. Names cease to be spoken, reputations are quietly rebuilt, and the record becomes a ledger. The survivors returned, if they returned, with dowries and a public instruction to forget. The state moves quickly to seal the breach. The public's appetite for scandal is satiable when bread and games resume. Yet the lives damaged within the palace cannot be wholly restored by ceremony or money. The social exile of a woman who has been paraded into court approval is not a wound a ledger can heal. Beyond individual tragedy, there is a larger lesson in this sequence of events. Even in ancient Rome, institutional mechanisms mattered as much as the emperor's caprice.
Caligula's cruelty, if we accept the contours that the sources offer, could not have persisted without the complicity of structures, a court culture that rewarded spectacle, a guard that enforced imperial will, senatorial bodies that often bowed rather than confronted, and families that sometimes traded their honor for safety. When power is concentrated and accountability weak, abuses can become normalized, ritualized, and bureaucratized. Historians today remain careful. Suetonius and Cassius Dio are explicit in their hostility at times. Suetonius wrote with a flair for scandal, and Cassius Dio composed histories that sought moral lessons in narrative. Tacitus, whose surviving fragments touch on the period indirectly, shares the same cautionary bent. Modern scholarship stresses 3 points. First, ancient sources often amplified stories to make moral claims about emperors and the state. Second, the palace's inner workings are opaque, and later histories may have filled silences with imagination. Third, where independent strands of testimony converge, accounts from freedmen, legal complaints, and multiple chroniclers, the likelihood rises that institutional patterns existed, even if particular anecdotes are embroidered. In short, treat the sensational details with skepticism, but weigh the pattern they collectively describe. To return to the human scale, the trauma endured inside the palace is most visible in lives that after return seemed like slow, living deaths. Some women never married. Others married but carried the burden in ways that affected parenting, social relations, and capacity for intimacy. The long-term psychological sequelae, dissociation, depression, social withdrawal, are intimated in the ancient record and fleshed out by modern readers who know what such prolonged abuse does to a soul. Keep in mind that words like defiled and corraded are ancient historians' terms used to convey indignity. Our job is to translate them into lived consequences without voyeuristic detail. There are also stories of resistance and small reclamations. A composite vignette can stand for these. A woman, returned and given a dowry, refuses to bow to the social scripts that would reduce her to silence. She speaks privately to a sister-in-law, tells an aunt, arranges for a small altar in a courtyard in memory of names she will not publicly speak. She keeps a memento, a simple woven band, for reasons that may be both personal and political. Such acts are tiny rebellions against the project of erasure. They matter because memory, however small, is the seed of restoration. We must also note the gendered nature of this apparatus. The palace's logic hinged on the idea that women's bodies could be appropriated as pawns in a larger game of imperial control. Men, senators, soldiers, courtiers, paid reputational costs, but for women, the costs often meant social death. This is not to say men were not humiliated or harmed. They were.
But the system weaponized feminine respectability in ways that removed from women the social tools to rebuild themselves. Again, ancient sources insist on scandal. Modern historians interpret these stories under the light of patriarchal structures in Roman society that made such retributions disproportionately harmful. One uncomfortable reality is how often families participated in their own erasure. This participation took many forms. Some households accepted the treasury's compensation. Some fathers forced daughters into the imperial household to secure political advantage. Some families endorsed silence as a necessary strategy for survival. These are choices made under coercive conditions, but they remain morally significant. The compulsion of empire can distort agency, but it does not wholly erase responsibility. The record thus implicates not just the sovereign, but the society that allowed the sovereign to act with impunity. If Caligula's name evokes grotesque anecdotes, it is because his reign became a kind of parable. Roman writers used him as a cautionary tale of imperial excess. Yet the deeper lesson is institutional. The Garden of Venus, as described by our sources, was not merely a reflection of one man's deviance. It was a machine made possible by laws of obedience, economic leverage, and a cultural appetite for spectacle. Where mechanisms exist to reduce persons to inventory, abuse becomes not an exception, but a function. There is also the matter of memory. After Claudius's accession and the settling of claims, Rome turned its attention elsewhere. The grooves of history began to fill. Later emperors had their own excesses. The public grew accustomed to cycles of scandal and forgetting. The names of the women who endured the palace's practices sank into that sediment. That is why remembering matters. Not to feed prurient curiosity, nor to settle modern political scores, but to restore dignity to lives that were publicly stripped of it. History's duty is to retrieve, to qualify, and to listen. We should pause, again, on sources. Suetonius, writing decades after Caligula's death, framed much of his emperology in moralizing anecdotes. Cassius Dio, working even later, compiled narratives that sometimes repeated earlier rumors. Both writers relied on court gossip, reports from exiles, and public memory. Modern scholars caution that such sources contain bias and rhetorical intent. But when we cross-reference their accounts with administrative records, where available, and with the broader socio-political context, a picture emerges. Whether every detail is true or not, institutions of power in Rome had the capacity to transform persons to objects of spectacle. When multiple independent testimonies recount the same phenomenon, instruments of naming, cycles of reward and punishment, stage displays, the likelihood that a systemic pattern existed rises, even if the exact tableaus differ.
What then does it mean to say that what happened inside Caligula's palace was more horrifying than death? It is not a claim that every person preferred death to life in those circumstances, nor that death was absent from the record. Rather, it is a moral argument about the quality of life that such mechanisms produced. Death ends liability, it ends memory. The erasure inflicted inside the palace, as the sources suggest, substituted a persistent social annihilation for a finalizing end. Survivors continued to breathe while their social identities, future marriages, family roles, economic prospects, were systematically eroded. The pain, humiliation, and loss of selfhood persisted. That is why certain ancient voices, recorders of both scandal and sorrow, present the palace's workings as a fate worse than a grave. Caligula's assassination ended his life in a violent collapse. It did not in itself dismantle the conditions that had enabled his abuses. Claudius's approach, pay compensation, reinsert survivors into the social lattice, avoid prolonged scandal, was a pragmatic remedy. It prioritized order over justice. That political calculus is an old one. Governments often choose stability over full accounting. The result is a public smooth-over that protects institutions while leaving victims to rebuild as best they can. The record of the era shows exactly this trade-off. The imperial household survives, the machinery of spectacle and power stays largely intact, and memory becomes a matter for private altars rather than public monuments. As we close, consider this. The story is not simply ancient gossip about a deposed tyrant. It is an instructive case about how systems convert private cruelty into public policy. When one person's desires become law, and the instruments of the state are mobilized to fulfill those desires without checks, the consequences ripple outward.
The Garden of Venus, if we accept the pattern described by ancient writers, was less an anomalous den of excess than an example of what happens when spectacle substitutes for governance and when institutions prefer calm to truth. Remember the composite Flavia for what she symbolizes, not a single life, but the lingering cost of institutionalized humiliation. Remember that Claudius's compensation, though helpful in the market sense, did not restore interior dignity. Remember also that sources that tell these stories are imperfect. They tilt toward scandal and must be read with critical care. Still, the convergence of testimonies, from chroniclers, court whispers, and the socio-political context, suggests that a system of calculated degradation existed and that its human toll was profound. If this account unsettled you, share it and tell us where you're watching from. Keep these erased voices in conversation. Remembering them is the simplest way to resist the erasure they once suffered.
The warning that history gives us is that unchecked power, dressed in ritual and wrapped in beauty, can invent cruelty as a policy. Our task is to hold institutions to account, to pay attention to the privatizations of sovereignty, and to keep alive the names that regimes sought to silence. We end without spectacle and without triumphalism. Caligula's body was lowered into oblivion, but the greater victory was never his. The victory would have been the recovery of dignity for those he harmed. That recovery, for most, never fully came. It is our duty, now across centuries, to remember, to question, and to insist that systems which treat people as instruments cannot be allowed to endure.